Here at the University of Liverpool, we've received many hundreds of messages asking for information, for guidance about some of the key issues which are now being raised after the EU referendum result. And what I'm going to do is just respond to many of those messages by explaining in more detail why I think the Leave campaign was so dishonest, and just as importantly, what relevance, if any, that dishonesty has for our current constitutional crisis here in the UK. So I've asserted that the Leave campaign were guilty of dishonesty on an industrial scale. And many people have asked me to flesh out that assertion in greater detail. So some of them are Remain supporters who feel that this is a fundamental issue which shouldn't be allowed to pass too easily. Some of them are Leave supporters who feel that I have some sort of obligation to justify such a strong criticism of a campaign that they voted for. And I'll begin by pointing out that, unlike the Remain campaign, most of the Leave campaign's key arguments were based on constitutional and legal issues. And therefore, it's relatively open, relatively easy for a constitutional lawyer like me to investigate and to evaluate the main planks of what the Leave campaign had to say. And on that basis, I really do have no hesitation whatsoever in concluding that Leave conducted one of the most dishonest political campaigns this country has ever seen. And for the sake of analysis, what I'll do is I'll organise that dishonesty into three key strands. The first strand is that on virtually every major issue that was raised in this referendum debate, Leave's arguments consisted of, at best, misrepresentations and at worst, outright deception. And I'll just take a few examples. There are actually many examples we could take, but we'll just take a few key examples. For example, we were told repeatedly that EU legislation is adopted by the unelected bureaucrats of the European Commission. And in fact, at public meetings that I attended in Liverpool and elsewhere, I would hear how 90-odd% of EU legislation is adopted by the unelected Commission. In fact, the actual number is 0%. 0% of EU legislation is adopted by the Commission, because the Commission doesn't adopt any EU legislative acts. All EU legislation is adopted by the Council, which consists of the elected governments of the Member States, in the vast majority of situations acting together with the European Parliament, which is directly elected by the citizens. Another example, and this was a favourite of Boris Johnson throughout the campaign, 60% of UK law derives from the EU. And again, this is simply not true. I looked into this assertion for the Treasury Committee in Parliament, for various fact-checked websites, academic and media, and this figure is based on a completely unscientific methodology that vastly exaggerates the influence of EU law upon the UK. It's simply a figure which has been manufactured in order to exaggerate the influence of EU law upon our legal system. We heard repeatedly that the EU was planning to create a European army which would absorb the British army against our will. That, of course, is completely untrue. European defence decision is done by unanimity between all of the member states. Nothing can happen in the field of defence without the agreement of every member state. And if the EU were ever to propose a common defence policy, it would require not just the unanimous agreement of the member states, but also domestic ratification of that agreement through their own constitutional systems. And in the UK, the European Union Act 2011 would have required another national referendum in order to approve any proposal for a common European defence. We also heard, for example, that Turkey was preparing to join the EU and that there was nothing that the UK could do to stop it. Again, that is completely untrue. The accession of any new member state to the EU requires the unanimous agreement of all of the member states, and again, the ratification of that agreement through their domestic constitutional systems. And several member states had already indicated that they would hold their own national referenda specifically on the question of Turkish accession, obviously in the expectation that their own populations would vote heavily against it. So there was simply no prospect of Turkey joining the EU in any of our lifetimes. I'll give one final example, and that's the example of TTIP. We heard a lot about how TTIP was going to lead to the privatisation of the NHS, was going to destroy the European social model. Well, actually, TTIP is an ongoing international negotiation. It will take years to conduct, if it ever gets concluded at all. And once an agreement is reached, that agreement will require the support of every single member state plus the European Parliament. And several member states had indicated that they would veto any deal which might threaten the European social model, the European welfare model. The worst claims of all, I think, related to immigration, but I suppose many of you may already have seen the University of Liverpool's webpage, which contains some of the real facts and figures and the legal framework concerning immigration from the EU. We could go on, but I think the key point is that through these means, the Leave campaign, I think, really set out to create a climate of fear among many of our fellow citizens, effectively trying to make people believe that they'd lost control of their country, that their democracy had been taken away, and that foreigners were to blame. The second strand of the Leave campaign was that throughout the referendum debate, they really promised things which they simply weren't in a position to deliver. And we're already seeing many of those promises begin to unravel. We all know that the £350 million a week, which was going to be spent instead on the NHS, well, actually, the £350 million a week doesn't exist, and it certainly won't be spent on the NHS. We were told repeatedly that a vote to leave the EU was a vote to reduce immigration. Apparently, they never really meant to say that a vote to leave the EU would actually lead to any reduction in immigration. And one of the examples which I found particularly interesting, which I heard at various public debates across the country, was the argument that you don't need to worry about UK nationals currently living in other EU member states because their rights will be automatically protected under the Vienna Convention. Now, besides the fact that if you asked them, they couldn't actually tell you which Vienna Convention they were referring to, I can fill in the blanks for them. They seem to be referring to Article 70 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which says that upon the termination of a bilateral agreement or withdrawal from a multilateral treaty, that the acquired rights of the parties shall be respected. But in this context, any public international lawyer would tell you immediately that refers to states. It does not refer to individuals, to companies, to businesses. Their rights are not automatically protected. They have to be agreed between the parties. Now, the third strand of the dishonesty, I think, which characterised the Leave campaign is really the converse of the previous two. Because I think Leave really set out to rubbish, to undermine anyone who disagreed with their views, anyone who pointed out that some of the things that they were claiming were not true, and really anyone who sought to provide a more sober, a more realistic analysis of some of the implications of what a vote to leave the EU would actually mean for the UK. Again, I'll just give one or two examples. We were told back in February when the Prime Minister struck his deal within the European Council that this deal was worthless and meaningless. It didn't have any legally binding force, that it didn't contain anything of significance for the UK. Well, actually, the strong consensus among virtually every European lawyer I've spoken to is that, of course, this was a legally binding deal, and it did contain various reforms which were of great significance to the UK's strategic interests within the EU, especially the new set of principles that would govern the relationship between the single market on the one hand and the single currency on the other, and also the proposals to create a power of veto for national parliaments over proposed EU legislation. Another feature which I think falls within this strand of the Leave campaign relates to some of the documents which were published by our Central Civil Service when the referendum was first called. These were the documents which set out the process of withdrawing from the EU and tried to describe the advantages and disadvantages of the various alternative options which would be available to the UK in the event of leaving the EU. And these documents, if we remember, were sort of at the origin of some of the allegations of Project Fear, that this was scaremongering, trying to frighten people into voting Remain. Well, I read those documents very carefully, and I found them to be completely objective, completely evidence-based, to be legally sound, and if anything, they probably underplayed some of the issues and some of the problems which the country would face in the event of a vote to leave. And a final example, which is of direct personal interest to myself and to many of my colleagues across the country, and this is the idea that any independent academic researcher who sought to challenge some of the claims being made by the Leave campaign was attacked, often in quite a personal, quite a vicious way. Their credibility, their independence, their competence was undermined. I'll give an example just of what happened with me. It didn't take very long before quite a lot of allegations started emerging that I'm somehow paid by the European Commission, that my salary is funded by the EU in order that I can indoctrinate our students in with pro-European propaganda. Whereas that's completely untrue. I'm an employee of the University of Liverpool. My entire salary is paid by the University of Liverpool, and the University of Liverpool does not receive a penny of external funding in order to pay that salary. So when we put all of that together, what does it add up to? Well, I think one of the most infamous political slogans of the 20th century was that if you're going to tell a lie, tell big lies. Don't tell small lies, because people catch you out on small lies. Tell giant lies, because most people are basically decent, they're basically trusting, and they would never really believe that anyone could be dishonest on such a massive scale. But I'm afraid that's probably what has happened in the UK over the last several months. The ideologues who make up the bulk of the Leave campaign have conducted a campaign which relied very heavily upon systematic dishonesty. And by doing so, by normalising and by legitimising this type of dishonesty as a primary tool to win votes, I'm afraid that Leave have inflicted quite untold damage upon the quality of our national democracy. Now, I expect that many of the people who voted Leave on the basis of some of the things that we've talked about will come to regret that decision. But really, I'm more fearful that many of the people who voted Leave, genuinely believing that they were going to get the things that they've been falsely promised, are only going to end up feeling more disenfranchised, more marginalised, more angry. But at this point, I would like to offer just one personal observation based on my own experience of the referendum campaign. We're told that statistical analysis indicates a correlation between voting patterns and factors such as age, level of education, income, and so on. And it may well be true that statistical analysis demonstrates that, but I think we should be very careful not to rush to overgeneralizations. For example, where I come from, West Belfast, a very working class part of the city, voted over 74% to remain. And I can say from my own personal experience that some of the best debates, the best public discussions which I participated in were in working class parts of Liverpool and Manchester, where people were genuinely engaged, enthusiastic, they wanted to know what this debate was about so as they could make the best decision for their families, for their country. So I think this referendum has very clearly flagged up some very deep, some very dark divisions within our society, but I think the story is a complex one, and we should be careful about rushing to generalise. But moving on, we've had a dishonest campaign. The question is, what relevance should we attach to that dishonesty now? To the current political situation of the UK? Should we accept it, learn some important lessons, but essentially move on? Or does the nature of the Leave campaign still have a role or a significance to play in our current political situation? And I'll begin with a fairly obvious observation. Now that Leave have secured their victory, their main campaigners seem to be standing back and saying, well, we don't have any plan. We have no idea what comes next. Almost, what are you asking us for? Now, Leave convinced many people in this country to tear up one of the fundamental pillars upon which the UK has evolved politically, economically, socially, diplomatically for a period of over 40 years. And it's only now that they're saying, we don't have a plan, we have no idea what comes next. And that does strike me, and I mean this more rhetorically, obviously, than in any strict legal sense, as really criminally irresponsible. But that has left us all in the midst of a constitutional crisis. Now, many lawyers are offering very important contributions about what the constitutional rules and what the constitutional limits are that should determine how we resolve our constitutional crisis. We're talking about the sovereignty of Parliament, the idea that the referendum result is not actually legally binding, that our sovereign Parliament can legislate as it pleases. We're talking about the relationship between the prerogative powers of the government and the need for parliamentary legislation, perhaps. And without making any particular judgment about these important legal debates, I suppose my view is that essentially this is a political crisis and it needs to have a political solution. And the responsibility for responding to this referendum result really lies with the government and Parliament. In whatever combination of constitutional power emerges, it's essentially a political judgment about what's now best for the country. And I think there were important arguments on both sides. On the one hand, we had a referendum. The Prime Minister indicated that the government would respect the outcome of that referendum, and a slim but appreciable majority of the people who voted to leave. And so I think there is clearly a strong democratic imperative which says that that vote should be respected, whatever its flaws, whatever the consequences. On the other hand, I don't think there's any doubt that large numbers of people across the country don't really accept the legitimacy of this referendum result, precisely because they regard it as having been procured through systematic dishonesty. And moreover, as the short-term and the longer-term consequences of leaving the EU begin to emerge more clearly, we have to remember that both the government and Parliament have a heavy but entirely proper constitutional responsibility to protect the national interests of this country. And that includes asking the question, whatever the answer, at least asking the question, how far is it in the national interest to execute this referendum result? And let's not forget, by the way, that certain Leave campaigners have a decidedly one-sided view of our democracy. We should recall that within moments of the polls closing on the 23rd of June, that Nigel Farage, when he thought that Remain had won this referendum, appeared before the national media, openly questioning the legitimacy of the entire poll, promising that he wouldn't accept the outcome, that he would, as he put it, continue until he had won his war. So it appears that some people's commitment to democracy only really goes so far as democracy gives them the answer they want to hear. So we do have a constitutional crisis, and we do need to weigh up a set of very difficult factors. We have the result of a flawed referendum, but it is a referendum. We have the sovereignty of our elected parliament, and it is a sovereign parliament. We have the responsibilities of our government as well. Politically, anything is possible, even if certain outcomes feel much more likely and others less so. But whatever happens, I'm afraid my real worry is that around half the country is going to feel like democracy has let them down. And that's a very sad and really quite troubling outcome. But one final observation. Finding a way out of our current constitutional predicament isn't just about what the UK now wants and what the UK now decides. Many of these choices are going to be made as much for us as they're going to be made by us. They're going to be made by the rest of the EU, they're going to be made by the rest of the international community, they're going to be made by the international financial markets and international trade. And we can already see clear evidence of this emerging every day. The 27 other member states of the European Union have made very clear that they are not going to wait forever for the UK to initiate its process of withdrawal. The Americans have reiterated their position that the UK is not a priority for international trade talks with the US. And the Chinese media have rather sarcastically noted that they didn't realise the UK had the 500 officials and the 10 years to spare in order to negotiate a trade agreement with China. Now, the Leave campaign told people that they'd lost control of their country, that they had to leave the EU to get that control back. But I think we're now seeing what that means in the real world, and it's what many of us had repeatedly warned against. It means less influence, it means less power, it means more isolation, it means more vulnerability. So, to conclude, if Parliament and Government were to decide not to fully implement the result of this referendum, which, strictly speaking, they are constitutionally entitled to do, they still need to offer a very convincing justification for that political judgment, both to the British people, of course, but also to the 27 other member states. And they'd also need to set out a very clear way forward for the future to help confirm the political legitimacy of such a decision, be it through national legislation, through a general election, through a second referendum. But if Parliament and Government decide, again, as they're perfectly constitutionally entitled to do, to implement the result of this referendum, then the real work begins. It begins internally. We need to undertake that massive job of thoroughly revising our entire legal system so as to prepare for our withdrawal without throwing significant parts of our economy, our society, into uncertainty and disorder. And also, of course, dealing with whatever constitutional convulsions emerge from Scotland, from Northern Ireland, from Gibraltar. But also externally, when it comes to the immediate challenge of striking a suitable withdrawal agreement with the rest of the EU, the more longer-term challenge of finding an appropriate relationship framework for our future relations with the EU after we've left, and also, of course, rebuilding much of our legal relations with the rest of the international community.